The moment 11-year-old Marcus Williams and his father David walked onto the Voice Kids stage together, something extraordinary filled the air. Not because it's the small hearing aids that Marcus wore behind both ears, barely visible unless you looked closely, but because of the way father and son moved in perfect synchronization, as if they had learned to communicate through a language that went far deeper than words or sound. What nobody in that studio knew was that Marcus had been born completely deaf, living in absolute silence for the first 7 years of his life, until revolutionary hearing aid technology finally allowed him to experience sound for the first time. And what was about to happen would prove that some of the most powerful love stories are written in silence before they're ever sung aloud. Hidden in their story was a bond forged by determination, strengthened by breakthrough moments, and sustained by the kind of father-son love that refuses to accept that dreams have limitations, even when those dreams seem impossible. Let me take you back to understand how this extraordinary pair reached this stage, because their journey proves that some of the most beautiful music comes from people who understand what it truly means to find your voice. Marcus Williams had been born profoundly deaf to parents who had no experience with hearing loss, no understanding of deaf culture, and no roadmap for raising a child who would navigate life through sight and touch, rather than sound. The early years had been filled with doctor consultations, hearing tests that confirmed what David and his wife Sarah already knew, and the gradual acceptance that their son would experience the world in ways they couldn't fully understand. David, a construction worker with calloused hands and a gentle heart, had initially struggled with feelings of helplessness. How do you sing lullabies to a baby who can't hear them? How do you communicate love through words that will never reach your child's ears? How do you share the music that had defined your own childhood with someone who lives in permanent silence? But Marcus had been a remarkably joyful child despite his deafness. He communicated through gestures, facial expressions, and an intuitive understanding of his parents' emotions that seemed to compensate for what his ears couldn't provide. He would place his hands on speakers when music played, feeling the vibrations that traveled through his small body, his face lighting up with smiles that suggested he was experiencing something beautiful even if he couldn't hear it. The breakthrough had come when Marcus was 7 years old. Revolutionary hearing aid technology had advanced to the point where even profoundly deaf children could potentially benefit from powerful digital devices that could amplify and clarify sound in ways that earlier technology couldn't achieve. The day Marcus received his first hearing aids was forever etched in David's memory. He had gone to the audiologist's office, Marcus sitting patiently while the devices were fitted and calibrated. When the audiologist finally activated them and spoke Marcus's name for the first time, the little boy's reaction had been immediate and overwhelming. Marcus had started crying, not from fear or discomfort, but from the shock of suddenly being bombarded with sensations he'd never experienced. Every sound in the room became magnified. The hum of air conditioning, the rustle of papers, the tick of a wall clock, his father's breathing. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. But the moment that changed everything had come when David, tears streaming down his own face, had leaned close to his son and whispered, "Marcus, can you hear Daddy?" Marcus had looked up at his father with wonder-filled eyes and nodded, then reached out to touch David's face as if trying to connect the sound with the person he'd always known through sight and touch. "Daddy," Marcus had said, his voice uncertain and slurred from 7 years of never hearing spoken language, "your voice sounds like music." From that day forward, Marcus had been obsessed with sound, with music, with the incredible world of auditory experience that had been hidden from him for the first 7 years of his life. But learning to hear wasn't the same as learning to understand. Everything was new, overwhelming, requiring months of speech therapy, auditory training, and patient practice as Marcus's brain learned to process and interpret the flood of information his hearing aids provided. David had become Marcus's guide into the world of sound. Every evening after work, he would sit with his son and introduce him to different types of music, different voices, different sounds. They started with simple melodies, children's songs with clear rhythms that Marcus could follow while reading David's lips and feeling the vibrations. Music, David would tell Marcus during their practice sessions, is like feelings that somebody figured out how to share with other people. When you hear a song, you're hearing somebody's heart. Marcus had been a remarkably fast learner. Within months of receiving his hearing aids, he was singing along to simple songs, his voice gaining clarity and confidence as his brain learned to connect the sounds he was making with the sounds he was hearing. By age 9, he was harmonizing with his father, their voices blending in ways that seemed impossible for someone who had discovered music so recently. But Marcus's relationship with sound was unique, profound in ways that people who had never experienced silence couldn't fully understand. He didn't take any sound for granted. Every note, every word, every musical phrase was precious to him, because he remembered what it felt like to live without them. "Daddy," Marcus had said one evening as they practiced together, "I think music saved me. Before I could hear, I was just Marcus. Now I'm Marcus who can share feelings with other people through songs." The idea to audition for The Voice Kids had come from Marcus himself. He'd been watching the show with fascination, studying not just the performances, but the emotional connections between coaches and contestants, the way music became a bridge between strangers, the way songs could make people cry or laugh or feel understood. "Dad," Marcus had said one evening after a particularly moving episode, "I want to sing there. I want to show people that music can find you even when you think it's impossible. I want to tell people about the first time I heard your voice." David had felt the familiar mix of pride and protectiveness that came with having a child whose journey had been marked by such profound challenges and triumphs. He knew Marcus's talent, knew the purity of his voice, and the authentic emotion he brought to every song. But he also knew that sharing their story meant opening themselves up to scrutiny, to questions about Marcus's deafness, to the possibility that people might focus on his hearing aids rather than his heart. But Marcus was determined with the kind of unshakable conviction that had carried him through years of learning to hear, to speak, to sing. "Dad, I want people to know that silence isn't the end of music. Sometimes silence is just the beginning, waiting for the right moment to become sound." The audition process had required special considerations to ensure Marcus could participate fully. The Voice Kids production team had worked with audiologists to optimize the stage acoustics for hearing aid users, had provided additional visual cues during rehearsals, and had educated everyone involved about the unique needs of performers with hearing differences. Standing on the voice stage now, Marcus felt every sensation amplified through his hearing aids. The whisper of air conditioning, the rustle of audience members shifting in their seats, the electronic hum of cameras and equipment, but underneath all those sounds, he could hear his father's steady breathing beside him, the familiar rhythm that had become his anchor in the world of sound. Blake Shelton, Kelly Clarkson, John Legend, and Niall Horan sat in their red chairs, their backs turned, unaware that they were about to meet a young performer who would redefine their understanding of what it meant to truly hear music, to find your voice when you thought you'd never have one. "Whenever you're ready, buddy," Blake called out encouragingly, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that Marcus had learned to recognize and appreciate through his hearing aids. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his small hands adjusting his hearing aids slightly to optimize their performance, then looked at his father for the reassuring nod that had preceded every important moment since he'd first learned to hear. "Before I sing," Marcus said, his voice clear despite the slight differences in pronunciation that came from learning speech later than most children, "I need to tell you about my dad and how music saved my life." The coaches remained in their chairs, but something in Marcus's tone suggested this wasn't a typical introduction. "I was born completely deaf," Marcus continued matter-of-factly. "For 7 years, I lived in silence. I couldn't hear anything, not my parents' voices, not music, not even my own voice when I tried to speak." David, watching his son share their story with such courage and clarity, felt tears beginning to form as he remembered those early years of uncertainty and hope. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "When I was 7, I got hearing aids that let me hear for the first time. The first voice I ever heard was my dad's voice, and he sounded like the most beautiful music in the world. The studio fell into moved silence as everyone processed what they were hearing, not just Marcus's words, but the profound journey they represented, the miracle of technology and determination that had given this child access to the world of sound. Marcus looked directly at his father, his voice filling with emotion. "My dad taught me that music isn't just sound. It's feelings that people share with each other. He taught me every song I know. And he taught me that being deaf for 7 years just made me appreciate hearing even more." David stepped closer to Marcus, understanding that this moment was about more than just an audition. It was about honoring their journey together, about sharing the miracle of Marcus's discovery of music with the world. "Dad, will you help me sing?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying across the silent studio. David nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he replied, "Always, son." Together, they began to sing "The Sound of Silence" by Simon and Garfunkel, but their version was transformed by Marcus's unique understanding of what silence really meant, what it felt like to live without sound before discovering the incredible gift of music. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again." As Marcus sang, his voice carried the weight of someone who truly understood both silence and sound, who had experienced the profound loneliness of being unable to hear before discovering the incredible connection that music could provide. David's deeper voice provided harmony, creating a musical conversation between father and son that told the story of their journey together. The coaches sat transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a talented child with a supportive parent. This was a performer whose relationship with music had been earned through years of silence, whose every note carried the weight of discovery and gratitude. When they reached the bridge, and in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, Marcus's voice soared with the kind of emotional authenticity that could only come from someone who had experienced both the darkness of silence and the light of sound. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. As Marcus and David sang together, something beautiful became visible to everyone watching. Marcus would occasionally touch his hearing aids, not because they were malfunctioning, but because he was still amazed by the technology that allowed him to participate in this moment, still grateful for the devices that had opened up the world of music to him. Blake Shelton was out of his chair before the song was finished, drawn to the stage by the sheer power of what he was witnessing. He found himself walking toward this father and son who were sharing not just a song, but a love story written in sound and silence. When they finished, the silence in the studio was profound, reverent, and Blake began to applaud, but instead of the typical standing ovation, he approached Marcus and David with the kind of respect usually reserved for seasoned professionals. "Marcus, David," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have never heard anything more beautiful in my life. Marcus, you didn't just sing that song. You gave it meaning that the original writers probably never imagined. You showed us what it really sounds like when someone appreciates every single note they're able to hear." All 4 coaches hit their buttons simultaneously, their chairs spinning to face a young performer who had just demonstrated that the most powerful voices often belong to those who understand what it means to live without them. Kelly Clarkson was already wiping tears from her eyes as her chair completed its turn. "Marcus, honey, what you just shared with us was more than a performance. You reminded us that music isn't something to take for granted, it's a gift, and you've shown us how precious that gift really is." John Legend, clearly moved, added, "Marcus, your story is incredible, but your voice is even more incredible. You've taken something that could have been a limitation and turned it into your greatest strength. That's what real artistry looks like." Niall, speaking directly to both Marcus and David, said, "That was absolutely beautiful. You've shown us that music really can save lives, that love really can overcome any obstacle, that family really can create miracles together." But Blake wasn't finished. He knelt down to Marcus's level, his voice taking on the quality of someone who had just witnessed something life-changing. "Marcus, I want you to know something," Blake said, his Oklahoma drawl thick with emotion. "You just taught everyone in this room that the most beautiful music doesn't come from perfect hearing or perfect voices. It comes from perfect hearts, from people who understand what a miracle it is to be able to share feelings through songs." David, who had been standing proudly beside his son throughout the performance, finally spoke up, his voice filled with the kind of paternal pride that comes from watching your child exceed every expectation. "Marcus has taught me that being deaf for 7 years wasn't something that happened to him," David said, his voice steady despite his tears. "It was something that prepared him to appreciate music in ways that most people never will. Every song he sings carries the weight of someone who remembers what silence feels like." Marcus and David chose Team Blake, not because of strategy or career goals, but because they recognized in him someone who understood that the best coaches don't just improve voices, they honor the stories that make those voices unique. Over the following weeks, Blake became more than Marcus's coach. He became an advocate for hearing accessibility in music, learning about hearing aid technology, working with the voice production team to optimize sound systems for contestants with hearing differences, and most importantly, helping Marcus understand that his journey from silence to song was his greatest strength as a performer. "Working with Marcus changed everything for me," Blake said in an interview during the live shows. "He taught me that music isn't just something you hear, it's something you feel, something you choose to share with others." Marcus chooses to share music every day, and that choice makes every song he sings more powerful than anything I've ever heard. Marcus's journey through the competition became a celebration of the journey from silence to sound, of the technology that makes dreams possible, of the father-son bonds that help children discover their voices. His version of Amazing Grace brought the studio to its feet. His duet with Blake on I Can See Clearly Now became an anthem about different kinds of clarity, different ways of experiencing the world. During the finale, Marcus performed an original song that Blake had helped him write, called The First Sound, as he sang about the moment he first heard his father's voice, about the journey from silence to music, about the gratitude that comes from understanding how precious every note really is. There wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Marcus finished first in the competition, but his real victory was already won. He had shown millions of viewers that hearing loss doesn't diminish musical ability, that silence can be the beginning of the most beautiful sounds, and that some of the most powerful voices belong to those who truly understand what it means to find them. In their final performance speech, delivered with Marcus holding the microphone while David stood proudly beside him, they shared a message that resonated far beyond the competition. "We want every person with hearing differences to know that silence isn't the end of music. It's just the beginning of a different kind of musical journey. And we want everyone to remember that the most beautiful sounds come from the most grateful hearts." Blake stood behind them throughout their speech, tears streaming down his face, as this 11-year-old boy taught the world a lesson about appreciation, determination, and the incredible power of music to transform silence into song. Today, Marcus continues to perform with David's unwavering support, using their platform to advocate for hearing accessibility and to show the world that people with hearing differences have incredible musical gifts to share. He's become a role model for young people with hearing loss, proving that silence and song can coexist beautifully. The hearing aids that Marcus wore on the Voice stage have been upgraded several times since then, but he keeps his original pair as a reminder of the day technology first allowed him to hear his father's voice and discover that music really could save a life. Blake Shelton learned something that night that changed his understanding of music forever. "Marcus taught me that the most powerful voices don't take sound for granted. They belong to people who understand that every note is a gift, every song is a miracle, every moment of music is something to be treasured because they remember what it felt like to live without it. Because sometimes the most beautiful music comes from people who understand what silence really means. Sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who had to fight to find them." And sometimes an 11-year-old boy with hearing aids can teach everyone that music isn't just something you hear, it's something you feel, something you choose, something that can save your life when you thought you'd never be able to participate in it. Marcus and David Williams proved that the voice isn't about perfect hearing or perfect sound. It's about perfect hearts, about the courage to share your story, about the understanding that music really can bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle, and transform any silence into the most beautiful song.